time you happen to be tuning into this. It's so great to be with you in this way, and hopefully it won't be too much longer before we are able to be together as a church family in person. Stay tuned for more info about that. And happy Valentine's Day as well, if that's a thing for you. It's not really for me, but I hope, like me, you enjoyed seeing different wedding photos of couples from our community as we honored and celebrated some of the #marriage moments from our church family this week on social media. And I just want to say we're going to be carrying on our preach series looking at the book of Joshua today. And today's story, I just want to be really clear, is not a Valentine's Day message. It is about a couple of Israelite spies who visit and meet a prostitute, but it is in no way a Valentine's Day message. I just want to say also thank you so much for those who gathered together with us to pray last Sunday night. We're gathering the first Sunday of every month. And it was such a hugely faith-building, deeply encouraging time together. So please join us for the next one. Stay tuned for more details about that. All right, so last week we did this. I'll just give you a quick recap of what we did. We kind of had a quick whistle-stop tour through Israel's history, and they find themselves now on the edge of the promised land, right on the cusp of the long-awaited promised land that they've been waiting for hundreds of years. And we looked in the start of Joshua, there are these two kind of looming questions hanging over Joshua as the new leader of the nation of Israel. The first question is, are the people going to follow me the same way that they used to follow Moses? And is God going to be with us in the same way that he was with us during the time of Moses? And what we saw last week in the chapter was that yes, the people were like, we're in, we're happy to follow you. And God was like, absolutely, in the same way that I was with Moses, so I will be with you. So that's like big tick, that's sorted, pressure off, let's go. And now we find ourselves in chapter 2. But what we looked at last week was that all of the 12 tribes of Israel were totally indispensable. We couldn't do without any of them. They all had a significant and a valuable part to play. And actually at their time of greatest vulnerability, they really pulled together and showed the strength of their togetherness. The other thing that we saw was that the land, or the rest, that the people of God were entering into was not really like a retirement plan. It wasn't that kind of rest. Actually, the land that they were entering into came with purpose, came with a mission. Remember, it was the crossroads of the earth. And so it came with a purpose for them being there. The other thing we saw was that God's presence enabled the people to be strong in their faith and courageous to obey, courageous to act. And we saw that actually the combination of these three, these are like three essential ingredients in the recipe, that God's presence was with them, they were strong in their faith and courageous in their acts. And that's what led to some of the miraculous conquests that we're going to see throughout the rest of this book. And if you know anything about what is coming up, maybe you've been thumbing your way through the book of Joshua this week, and if you have, good on you, and I hope that you're enjoying your journey through it so far. You'd have in the back of your mind that you know that eventually in this book, Israel is going to conquer the whole of the land of Canaan. You kind of know what is coming. Heather and I, a short while back, we watched a few war documentaries that were on Netflix. We watched a Vietnam War documentary and World War II documentary, and you kind of know how the wars are going to finish. But it's still really interesting as you journey through, how did we get to that ultimate victory? How do we get to the end point at the end of that period? And that's kind of what it's like for us as we thumb our way through Joshua. Well, we know where it's going to end up, and we know that Israel is going to conquer Canaan. We know that the enemies of God are going to be destroyed. There's going to be lots of bloodshed. And it's going to pose lots of questions for us around violence and war and genocide and bloodshed and the problem of evil and how God deals with sin. And we're going to tackle those sorts of questions, I promise, as we work our way through the series. But the thing that we want to see from the outset is that the first conquest that happens in the land of Canaan is not a great military victory. Actually, the first conquest that happens is a victory of the heart. It's a triumph of grace. That's the first thing that we see here in this book as Israel enter into Canaan. There's this lady, Rahab. She was a prostitute. She's not someone that you would have expected to be part of the people of God, but she does get accepted into the people of God. And the implication for the rest of this book is that actually that acceptance into the family of God is available to anybody if they choose to follow Rahab's path. And that's what we kind of see from the outset of the book. We see that actually the stories that kind of rise to the top in the book of Joshua are not stories of great military conquest. Actually, the stories that the author tends to spend time on in this book of Joshua are stories of redemption and rescue. And like in any great military conquest, in any historical narrative about those sorts of things, you would have expected it to be different. I don't know if you've heard the expression before that history is written by the victors. Well, you'd expect victors to write about great feats of strength, great military might. It seems kind of backwards that actually these stories of redemption and rescue trump the stories of great military conquest in the book of Joshua. And the fact that this act of grace right at the front of the book of Joshua takes place before any other conquest, it tells us that actually that we're meant to see that the grace of God tempers his wrath. The grace of God tempers his wrath. The grace of God is greater, and love ultimately is going to triumph over his wrath. And that's the message of the gospel, actually, is that the wrath of God doesn't have the final word, and that the grace of God ultimately wins. That doesn't mean that God doesn't have wrath against sin. Of course he does, but the invitation to repent and believe is here right from the beginning of the book of Joshua. So we're going to pick it up in chapter 2. I'm going to read out some verses. We'll dip into them. Otherwise, in different patches, I'm just going to tell you the story. Please go back and read it for yourself as well. So the chapter starts in chapter 2 with the sending of these 2 spies. It says this: Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Yes, that is a literal place. And he says, go and look over the land, he said, especially the land of Jericho. It's kind of like a repeat of what happens in Numbers 13 when Moses sends these 12 spies to go and spy out the land of Canaan, except that it went really differently this time. See, previously he sent 12 spies, but only 2 came back with positive reports. That was Joshua and Caleb. And actually what that led to was the Israelite nation wandering the desert for a bunch more years. And Joshua was like, hey, we're not going down that road again. Let's not send 12 spies. Let's not multiply the opportunities for failure. Let's just choose 2 really good spies, send them, and expect them to come back with these faith-filled reports. It goes on to say, so they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. Like, that's a suspicious choice of residence. What's going on here? Well, it's not really actually as strange as it might initially sound. See, this, like a prostitute or an innkeeper's house would have been like a really common place for spies to go and try to source some conspirators to join them in their plan. Like, picture a tavern, a hostel, like this underbelly gathering of scoundrels and thieves. Like that's what this innkeeper's house, this prostitute's house would have been like. You know, shifty places attract shifty people, the kind of people that you want to join in on your rebellion. And so Rahab lives in this kind of place. Now, picture like any old Western or any of the bars that Mando in The Mandalorian goes to, where he's, wanting to gather intel, like dusty bars, dark corners, shifty people. That's what this place is like. And so it's not the most desirable of places. And to be honest, Rahab's not the most desirable of people. Actually, she is a female Canaanite prostitute. And in this time, that would have been a really unusual choice for somebody to align yourself with. You would have typically wanted, obviously, a strong, influential male, probably one of the king's guards or something like that, who could join you in your quest to maybe poison the king's food or some kind of espionage act like that. You wouldn't have wanted some powerless prostitute. So it's not surprising at all in the sense that they end up in Rahab's house. What is surprising, though, is that she becomes the center point of the story, that she joins them in her quest, and in a sense actually becomes the hero of this whole tale. So the spies, they go to her after hearing that the king knows about them, and she agrees to hide them. Then she lies to the king's officials about where they are, and she deceives the king's officials so that they go out of the city to go to try to find the spies. And she does this so that they can obviously escape unharmed. And then she goes on to give the reason why she's gone to all this trouble. She says this in verse 9. She says, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. Verse 10, we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and the earth below. Now, I don't know how she'd come to hear about God, but she'd obviously heard that this God had parted the Red Sea, that this God had defeated the Amorite kings. And she looked around at her kind of Jericho compatriots and realized they were all freaking out. They were all terrified. And while like the king of Jericho and his men and the rest of the city are preparing themselves for battle, what we see here is that Rahab is actually preparing her heart to worship God. She is preparing herself to submit to his will, to submit her life to him. And it's a really important distinction here, because everybody's heard about the salvation that God has brought, but there are these two different responses. There's the response to double down, to resist and to fight, or there's the response to submit and to surrender her will to the Lord. That's how Rahab chooses to respond. And what it shows us is that for the rest of the Canaanites, like Rahab, salvation is available to anybody who calls on the name of the Lord. It's available to them just like it was for her. Now imagine, for you and I, imagine that France or a country like that grew to like global power again and started to look to conquer different lands around us and conquer some of our neighbours. Imagine that France took over New Zealand and Indonesia, and they hadn't touched us yet, but it was getting closer and closer to us. How would we, as citizens of this nation, if you are, how would we respond in a moment like that? Well, probably one of two ways. We'd either prepare ourselves to go to war, or we'd be starting to brush up on our high school French, right? Like we'd either be resisting and getting ready to fight, or we'd be preparing to surrender and submit ourselves to that invading army. When Jesus came, he defeated the two great enemies of sin and death. These two great enemies that we thought were going to be in power forever, but he defeated them. And we should have that same kind of visceral reaction when we realize that this invading army has come and it's defeated these two great foes already. We've kind of been left with these two same options. Do we resist and do we fight, or do we submit and surrender to Jesus' will? And the story carries on in verses 12 to 14. I'm not going to read them out for you now, but I just want to flag for you as you read, you'll see that the same word used 3 times in these few verses between Rahab and the spies. It's this word kindness, which is the Hebrew word hesed. What does hesed mean? Well, hesed is usually associated with like covenant loyalty or covenant faithfulness. It's associated with the steadfast love of God, a love that's not dependent on how the Israelites relate to him, a love that's dependent on the covenant that he's chosen to make with them. It's a love that doesn't change, and regardless of what they do. And Rahab and the Israelite spies use this word in their agreement that they make towards each other. It's like Rahab is saying to the spies, as I've shown hesed kindness to you, please show this same hesed kindness to me, because God's a God who shows hesed kindness to all of us. That's kind of the basis of her argument. And because of Rahab's faithfulness in this, actually God is faithful to her and to her family. And actually here's the kicker, here's the incredible thing about this woman, is that she ends up becoming the line that provides salvation to the whole earth. It's her line, it's her faith that provides salvation to the whole earth. She is one of the 4 mothers that Jesus has in the Matthew 1 genealogy. She's one of the 4 women mentioned there. She's also one of the ancestors of the great King David, the king of the people of God. She's also mentioned in the book of James as somebody who had saving faith. She's also mentioned in the letter to the Hebrews, in Hebrews 11, in that faith hall of fame. Like, it's phenomenal when you consider where this woman has come from, the kind of airtime that she gets in the Bible. It's phenomenal. Back to the story. So the spies right now are going to go into detail about how they're going to go about protecting Rahab. So they say, look, we're going to go now, and then we're going to come back, and we're going to come back with all these armies, and they're going to completely wipe out the city. You need to know that's going to happen. But here's what we want you to do. We want you to tie a scarlet cord, this red rope, tie the scarlet cord off your window, hang it out your window. And then what we'll do is when we come, we see that scarlet cord, we'll tell all the armies around, hey, no one in that house is to be touched. They are safe. We're to pass by them. Right? And so gather all your family, gather your mother, your brothers, your father, your sisters, your cousins, everybody that you can, fit them into your house. And when we come, we're going to pass by that house and you guys will be safe. But don't let anybody leave that house. If they do, we can't be responsible for what's going to happen to them. Stay in the house. And this is kind of like the new Passover. It's the same idea, it's the same imagery, it's the same language that gets used. I think it's Exodus 11 or 12, back when the Passover happened for the people of God, when they used the scarlet blood to paint over their doorposts as kind of like this sign of protection, that they would be passed over, the judgment would be passed over, and they would be safe inside their house. And it's the same kind of idea here, is that scarlet cord means that the Israelite army are going to pass over, and the people inside that household are going to stay safe. It's this beautiful, like Old Testament picture of the Passover that's happening this time, not for Israel, but it's happening for the Gentiles. So what happened for Israel is now happening in the nations. And that's kind of pointing to the trajectory of where this blessing is going to be going from the people of God to the nations of the world. It's also this beautiful Old Testament picture of Jesus, that Jesus is coming, he's defeated the two great enemies, and that all we have to do is call on his name and rest in that place, and we'll be saved. That's all that it takes. As long as we remain in him, as long as we abide in him, as long as we stay close to him, as long as we rest in him and stay in that place, we'll be saved. And here's the crazy thing, right? Like, Rahab did literally nothing really to earn her salvation. Like, what did she do? She declared that Yahweh was Lord over heaven and earth, and then she stayed in her house. Like, that's all she did really. But she was saved from the coming wrath. And in a sense, it's like the same for you and I. All that we do is we declare Jesus as Lord and stay in that place. We stay in that place. See, you can look to that scarlet cord. You can look to the cross, and you can put your trust there, your hope there, your confidence there. You don't need to be fearful or worried, because if you look to the scarlet cord or to the cross, you know that you'll be saved. You'll know that the wrath will pass over you. And as I draw to a close here, I just want to ask you a few questions that maybe you can reflect on if you're by yourself at the moment, or if you're with other people, they might stimulate some discussion for you. The questions are these. Rahab's journey towards the family of God, it started because she heard stories about the good things that God had done. In a sense, the testimony of God paved the way for her to become part of the family of God. So we might not see C's part. We might not see, great military conquests in our lifetime, but do those around us have the chance to see and to hear the good things that God has done in our lives as well? Because God is present with us. He's promised he always will be. He's intimately and intricately involved in his creation. He is involved in your life and my life, in our lives. And do people know that? And maybe it's just that he grants you peace in an incredibly tense meeting at work. Maybe it's he gives you energy and he gives you patience after a number of sleepless nights in a row with young children. Maybe it's because you don't have the same sort of fear or anxiety or worry or concern that other people do about the future, because your hope is somewhere else. Perhaps it's because his hand has been on you in helping you to win that project or win that bid. Whatever it might be, do those around you have the chance to hear and to see the way that God has been at work in your life? Does your life, does the testimony of your life pave the way for somebody else to come into the family of God? That's the first question for you. The second question is this. Perhaps when we talked about those two different ways of responding to Jesus, either to fight or to submit to him, you thought, well, I've surrendered most of my life to him. Like I'm pretty much surrendered everything to him, but you know that there's still some things that you're fighting him on, actually. There's still some things that you're not willing to let go of. It might be a habit. It might be a hobby. It might be how you use your time. It might be your pursuit of something. It might be a relationship. Like I've surrendered most of my life to him, but there are still some things, if I'm honest with myself and with him, that I'm fighting him on. There's some pieces that I don't want to let go of. Well, the reality is that those pieces have become idols for you in your life. Because either you love those pieces more than you love him, or you don't trust God enough with those things. And maybe it's a combination of those two things. Maybe it's something different. But either way, if you're really honest with yourself, what is it that you're fighting him on that you haven't fully surrendered to him? And the third question is this. Who have you shown hesed kindness to lately? The kind of covenantal love, the kind of covenantal faithfulness, the kind of covenantal loyalty that isn't dependent on how somebody else relates to you or how you feel. Who is it that you've shown hesed kindness to lately? Who do you need to show some hesed kindness to? So this story of Rahab, it's this beautiful story that shows us that actually there are a few things from the outset of the book that we really need to get in our mind before we tackle the rest of it. The first thing is that the conquest of foreign land starts here in the story, not with a great military victory, but actually with a triumph of grace, with somebody coming in to the family of God. And that no one actually is too far from the grace of God. That actually his hesed kindness, his covenantal love, his salvation is available to all of us, and we can just rest in that place. And so I wonder, could we just do that actually right now? Before we do anything else, before we get to the questions, before you flick this off and go have lunch or dinner or whatever time of day it is for you, before you go anywhere or do anything else, can we just do that? Can we just rest in Jesus? Just rest in what he's done. Rest in that place. Abide in him. Remain in him. Reflect on the wonder of who he is and what he's done. You might find it easy to identify with someone like Rahab. You might find that a little bit more difficult. But actually, wherever you're at, whether you call yourself a Christian, whether you're not sure if you're a Christian or you're sure you're not a Christian, the reality is that we were all outside of the camp. We're all dead in our sins and our transgressions. We're all lost apart from him. What the story shows us is that God is very willing to accept, to assure, and to include, to welcome us in to the family of God. Not because of anything we've done, but because of everything that he is. So let's just for a moment, just rest in the wonder of that place.
What I'd like God to see in this city is to see us evangelize more to the Chatswood community. And I think two ways. One would be to see those people who are part of the Chatswood community and haven't really encountered God before, see them be welcomed into our numbers. Just like when the disciples started the early church, God added to their numbers daily. I think that would be such an encouragement for us to see and to act on. And I know that God's already been adding to our numbers during this pandemic online, and that's just such a testimony to God that even though people can't come and see the physical community, that they still feel welcomed and intrigued by God's message, and to come and join us online. And I think the second one is I have such a heart for the homeless community, and I think seeing those people come to know God and to know that there is hope, and that there is God that cares about them and loves them. And I think the Bible passage that came to mind was Matthew 25, verse 34. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me." And I think that's just such an example of what God's heart is for his people and for us to do to all his people around the world. And we just, I just hope that we can do that this year and just see those who are less fortunate than us, particularly in this pandemic when people have lost their jobs and their houses or opportunities, and that we can just go and evangelize to those people and bring them not only their physical needs, but also their spiritual needs. So that's my hope for the church this year, and I just pray that, we all be strong and courageous and do that.